Hello, I'm Osama Rahman. I am the director of the Data Science Campus at the UK Office for National Statistics, and I'm here today at the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence annual conference. And I have with me Professor Rohini Pande. Professor Pande is the Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at Yale University, where she's also the director of the Economic Growth Centre. Welcome. So you've spoken to us today about issues around how voluntary carbon credit markets work. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Osama. It's great to be here. So, as climate change is advanced, I think individuals often think about what can we do, especially when we don't see national governments perhaps acting with the fervor you would want them to. And I think for every individual, one way you think you can act is by buying carbon offsets. So when you go on a flight, you might think, oh, I'm going to contribute to greenhouse gas. Let me just click the button at the bottom that says how to offset your flight. And this is just one example of a broad market on carbon offsets, which has really seen incredible growth between the last 3 or 4 years. However, more recently, in the last year itself, we saw the price of this market crash and the stock market valuation of most of the big players on this market crash. And so what I was talking about today was really trying to understand why has this market failed and whether the underlying causes of the problems in this market have to do with issues of measurement and institutional design that we as economists and statisticians can possibly speak to. So in looking at this market, it's important to recognize that there are many players. This is not a regulated market. There is no government coming in and setting standards. Rather, at the most extreme end, you have, as I said, people like you and me who want to offset their flight emissions, or companies or other players who say that they want to reduce their emissions but aren't able to do it, either because the nature of their activity makes it impossible or that it's very expensive. So these are the people who are going to be entering the voluntary carbon market to buy carbon offsets. Who do they buy from? They typically buy offsets that come from individuals who say that we will make sure that there's a certain amount of carbon that will not go into the air. And perhaps the most well-known example of this is forest projects. So groups that will come in and say that we will ensure that a certain amount of forest in the Amazon or in the tropics is not going to be deforested. In order to ensure that, they need money to compensate people for, say, the loss income from not undertaking this activity, and that they would get by selling the carbon offsets. This is the group of project developers. They will usually sell it on to the people who want to buy the permits, but through a market that involves both brokers and very often registries that will verify it. So this seems like a great setup, except that it's a market which has a lot of non-transparency. So starting from the fact of how do I actually know that the person selling me carbon offsets to not cut down a forest is actually talking about a forest that would have otherwise been cut down. So this is what, as economists, we would describe as additionality. Is it really the case that the money being paid to the project developer is preventing an activity that would have happened usually? So the first issue in this market is we right now have no single agreed upon ways to measure additionality. A second is that the groups of people who are usually involved for ensuring that this additionality is certified are people who are paid for very often by either the brokers or the project developers. And as a result, there's a huge conflict of interest in terms of them showing high levels of additionality, because that increases the carbon revenue, which is what's going to pay all these players. So these are just two of the basic problems that come from a system where there is not much regulation, not certification, and significant conflict of interest. Perhaps the most striking way this reflects itself in the market is we have many different types of carbon credits, each of which often costs a different amount, which should really not be the case because they're all supposed to be doing exactly the same thing, preventing a ton of carbon dioxide from being emitted in the air. And I think a recognition of all these factors has caused the market to currently be in disarray. And so what I was talking about today is whether we can use insights from field experiments on institutional design and evaluations of projects like Payment for Ecosystem to think of a way forward of how you might be able to certify projects that we think work. So, for instance, you could use experimental evaluations to create what we would call a counterfactual, what would happen without the program, and use that to inform the estimates of how much additionality there is from a project. Similarly, when it comes to the conflict of interest of verifiers, we could put in place institutions that ensure that their payments are not a function of the amount of additionality they find for a project. And then finally, I think the most speculative policy that I talked about, but I think is worth exploring, is whether voluntary carbon markets can actually move a little bit closer to compliance markets in terms of having a regulator who helps set an overall cap on the amount of emissions that are going to be produced, or to put it another way, how much carbon offsetting needs to be done, and use that as a way to provide some market discipline and ensure that there is a single market clearing price and more transparency.
Now, there's been some field experiments to sort of look at try to get some parameterization on additionality and things like that. Can you tell us a bit about some of those experiments?
Sure. So one of the best known experiments comes from a paper called Cash for Carbon that a colleague of mine, Seema Jayachandran, and her co-authors wrote and came out in Science. This was done in Uganda in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy Group, where the basic idea of the field experiment is that you randomly assign the set of, in this case, forest plots where the owners were paid 70,000 shillings per hectare to not deforest. Now, what you can do is, because you're going to decide who's getting paid and who isn't getting paid in effect by lottery, you can, after a certain amount of time, in this case 2 years, compare the outcomes across those two groups and see whether there's a difference in deforestation. The authors found that the rates of deforestation were roughly halved by the Payment for the Ecosystem project, telling us that this is actually a project that has additionality. And I think the kind of learnings from this project that you could take to carbon offset project more broadly is some learnings on how much money you need to pay in order to see additionality, but importantly also kind of calibrate our estimates by the kind of take-ups we see in the real world. So in this particular case, roughly 50% of individuals took up the program. That's an important metric. So rather than saying, if you have this program, everyone will take it up, you realize only half the people will take it up, and that should affect your cost effectiveness estimate.
And there's also an issue around auditors being able to audit properly, if firms are actually delivering on particulate reductions and things like this. And you've been involved in some work on measuring that as well.
That's right. So we used exactly the same methodology, but this was in Gujarat in India, where we actually worked with the regulator who was keen to reduce what they saw as widespread shopping of auditors by plants. So in this case, the institutional reform we suggested is, rather than firms shopping for an auditor, there be an assignment of certified auditors to plants by the central regulator. And importantly, that they actually get paid off a fixed price schedule, so you can't actually shop on price either. And both of these we saw led to significant improvements in the quality of measurement.
Excellent. Now, you've also done a lot of work where you're interested in the role of public policy in providing the poor and disadvantaged with political and economic power. And how notions of economic justice and human rights can help justify and enable such change. Can you tell us a bit about some of that work?
Sure. I think at the center of all of my work is the thought that once you start working on a question, I think you need to follow the highest levels of scientific rigor. So where as a researcher, I think we have leeways in choosing the questions we work on. And from the start, I've been very interested in asking about how institutional design can help impact who benefits from programs. I think in a set of contexts, be it thinking about economic growth or any development program, we know that none of these are a tide that lift all boats. And so they always have to be accompanied by some forms of redistribution. And typically this redistribution doesn't occur in a vacuum, but occurs largely in democracies by elected politicians. So I have, for instance, been very interested in thinking about the role of transparency. I talked a bit about it in this context of voluntary carbon markets, but also in terms of how much voters know about politicians. Another area that I think I've worked on for quite a long time is to think about how do you provide finance to poor households. This is an area where I think the evidence has for a long time been quite mixed. So really thinking about, again, project design features, how do you actually tweak the design to improve it is valuable. And then finally, I think thinking about these issues has certainly brought me to work on something that's close to my heart, which is the question of how do you create an equal playing field for men and women. And this, I think, is particularly important in the part of the world where I come from, which is South Asia.
Okay. And just one final question, now given your career, what advice would you give to early career researchers just starting on their journey?
So as I always tell both students and young researchers who ask me something like this, is I feel my role is to, I think, provide information, not to give advice, because there are many ways to succeed in the profession. And to some extent, everyone has to choose their own path. But what I think is true, and this is something I see in my research and I see it in certainly our profession, is it's a hard field to navigate when you're always trying to guess how actually the profession is functioning. And so I think, getting information is incredibly important. I think one thing I'd say that I think is valuable, it's hard to often manifest, is, getting a peer group that you can rely on, talk to. I think is important in economics in particular. I think increasingly we see a lot more co-authored work. I think this is particularly the case in development, where this is, you often have to go to the field, spend a lot of time. But even more generally, I think increasingly there is no sense in which sort of single authored work is being prioritized more than co-authored work. So I think identifying your peers or others who you would work with, ideally having a good mentor, but I realize that's often hard for people to achieve on their own. I think those are important things. I think asking questions, I think our profession is a very entrepreneurial profession. So I think the more you can be willing to be an entrepreneur, I think that's important. And then I think another part that I think is valuable, I realize it's often harder to implement, especially for often, young researchers who may have young families as well. But I think there are huge returns to mobility and visibility in the profession. So, trying to make sure you're at conferences, you're giving talks. And people often ask me, how do I get myself invited to a seminar? I agree, that's hard. But I think conferences are something you can always be submitting papers to. And so I just think being out there, being visible. And then finally, I think the most important thing is work on things you're interested in. I think when I started my PhD, I think a lesson I learned very early on was the first paper I ever worked on was a paper that incredibly bored me. And the thought of sitting there and doing this for the rest of my life was a very depressing thought. I was lucky enough that I managed to find something else that I worked on. But I think it taught me early on that, we're economists and we should pay attention to notions of sunk cost. But importantly, I think just working on issues that we find interesting has to be at the center of what we do.
Actually, I'm going to ask a final question, because this is something we've both been involved in different spaces. I know that you've been recognized for your work in promoting the success of women in the economics profession. It's something I've worked on within a government economist context to try and attract, retain, and progress more women into economics. Can you say anything about your work in that specific area and what you've done there?
I think, my sense is that a lot of what you have to do is just kind of listen to people and, listen to the ways in which they want to be supported. I mean, each person is different. And for someone, it's going to be, reading the abstract of the paper. For someone else, it's just going to be listening to them about the frustration they felt when they were talked over by someone else. In some cases, it may then require you going and talking to the person who talked over them and say, that was not something that was appreciated. So I think that's one. I think the other thing is, I think really matters is, role models and mentors. So I think we far too often, in departments hear statements like, of course, we'd like to hire more women, or, we'd like to have more diversity, but the pipeline is too thin. And there are always other things you can do, right? I mean, so maybe the pipeline generally in hiring assistant professors this year is too thin, but that's no reason why all the visitors in the department are male or all the seminar speakers are male. So I think just there are a lot of places where there is discretion, which are the visitors you bring in, the conference speakers. Those are also much, much easier to move. But I think if someone doesn't highlight that, I think it's easy to stay with the status quo. We know networks matter. And I think one of the reasons women often find it hard to enter is that they are often not part of the networks that are matching these professions. So that would be my sense. But I'd be curious to hear from you. What have you found in thinking about it in government departments?
I think the other thing I'd add is the role of champions. And I think I was the first non-white chief economist in government. And then having people who supported me and championed me, I think, has been an important part of my career journey. And therefore, I felt that's an important role for me to play for others as well. And then the other thing is, you were talking about the pipeline. I think the way we recruited people into the government economic service was quite narrow initially. There was one entry scheme. And then eventually, with myself and a couple of others who thought this was a bit too narrow, we opened up another scheme. And then more recently, we have opened up the Government Economic Service Applied Economics Degree Apprenticeship, which if you join, it's a job, but it comes with academic training in economics as well. There's no fees. You have a salary during this time. And so that is beginning to change the nature of the picture of who we see at the entry level in the government economic service. Yeah. So those have been some of the things we've been doing. Exactly. I think the championing is quite, and speaking up. The speaking over is one I've noticed, and I felt I've had to go and talk to people about how you spoke over this person, and often in cases where the person knows a lot more than you, and you're just dismissing them because of what you see in front of you.
Yeah. I think one thing that's tricky, I think, is, and I've worked on issues to do with ethnicity or class and others. I found that people personalize gender issues much more than the others. So you can sit in an academic seminar, talk about income redistribution to a set of, I'd say, reasonably rich people, and they're all very much in favor of income redistribution. In the same room, you give a talk on gender issues, and I think people's reactions, well, I'm not a misogynist. And you're like, this is abstraction. I'm not talking about you as a person, but, just the averages. So I think that's something I think is still one needs to work on, is to make people realize that a lot of these spaces are not kind of personal spaces, and they don't have to personally kind of tell you their ideology.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, with that, Professor Rohini Pande, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here.